recording was made with Esther Gibson Cannon, born between Ardmore and Gainesville in the Indian Territory, the year 1882. Mrs. Cannon came to Ardmore in 1901 to teach. She was then 19 years old. The present date is February 9th, 1956. The place of the recording is 906 West Broadway, Mrs. Cannon's home. Mrs. Cannon, would you tell me something about your school building that you first taught in?
The building in which I taught had been an old store building, moved out from Main Street. It was 2-story, 2 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms above. It housed the first grade and the second and third grades downstairs. And upstairs were the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grades. I had the second and third grades with 103 children enrolled. Anyone who has taught knows that 30 is supposed to be quite a number. The superintendent very kindly told me I needn't try to teach. If I'd hold them together, I'd do well.
That's very good. How many teachers did the school have in all?
There were 4 teachers. Miss Anna Matthews had first grade. Miss Meta Smith had first grade. I had second and third. Miss Fanny Walker had 4th and 5th. And Miss Anna Matthews, who is now Mrs. Norris, had the 6th and 7th.
Mm-hmm. Well, what subjects did you teach in the school as a whole?
Well, of course, in the second and third grades, the teaching is very simple. But with that number of children, you can't do much but just hold them together.
I see. Could you tell me any of the incidents that happened among your students?
As I've said, the superintendent very kindly told me that if I held them together, I'd be doing well. But the school board took action and finally allowed me to take the second grade in the morning and the third grade in the afternoon. But even so, the room was more than crowded. We had little double desks in which 2 children were supposed to sit. But when all the children were there, we had 3 in a seat. So they had a good deal of scrambling to get books out of their little desks.
I imagine so. What did the students wear to school then?
Oh, the simplest sort of things. Their little dresses, girls' dresses, were not as short as little girls' dresses are now. And they wore really shoes and stockings.
Mm-hmm. Well, are the boys in that time in school as rowdy as they're played up to be? I mean, do they dip pigtails in ink?
No, indeed. They were just as nice as they could be. Oh, that's just foolishness. One of the, speaking of hair, though, I had a little boy who had real curly hair. His hair kinked up on the top of his head. He was very studious, and as he sat one day trying to work a little problem, he had a pencil stuck up in his hair, just working as hard and thinking as hard as he could. And he happened to think of the answer, and he jerked that pencil to write his answer down and pulled his hair. And he nearly jumped out of his seat.
I imagine so.
And that set us all off to laughing, and we laughed the rest of the day.
Well, during the winter, did you have any trouble with the attendance in the school?
Well, somewhat. But children brought their lunches. Of course, there were no lunch rooms, but the children brought their lunches in little baskets or bags and just sat around on the floor and had their lunch.
What type of heating did your school have then?
Nice old stoves.
The great big black one?
Yeah.
I see. Well, Mrs. Cannon, did the students do very much extracurricular activities?
No, there was very little of that type of thing, especially among the little children, the age children that I had. Now, what their high school activities were, I don't know.
You never had any game times or anything like
No,
that?
we did not. Of course, there was a recess period when the children went outside and played.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, there wasn't anything at all, and that was not supervised at all.
I see. Miss Cannon, I've heard that you had a very interesting courtship and marriage to Mr. Cannon, and if you'd like, I'd like for you to tell us something about that.
Well, I suppose everybody's courtship is interesting to them, but I hope that this will not be boring to anybody else. I met Mr. Cannon at a dance given by the Elks Club, which in those days was quite the social center. I had not gone to the dance with any young man, but had gone with some married friends and met Mr. Cannon. He very kindly asked me to stay until the dance closed, but having come with my friends, I insisted upon going home with my friends. Then he asked if I'd go to the dance the next week. And I told him, yes, I'd be very glad to. But in the week, I began thinking about it, and I decided I didn't want to go with that young man at all because he was a good deal older than I. I've been used to going with high school boys at just my age, and I just had a good time with them, and this seemed to be such a dignified young man. So I said to the lady with whom I lived, Miss Will Cruz, that I thought I would just write a note to my friend, this gentleman, and tell him that I didn't care to go, that I had other things to do. Miss Cruz was a very snappy somebody. She had bright red hair and blue eyes, and her eyes just popped at me, and she said, "You'll do no such thing. He's a nice young man, and you should go with him. You told him you'd go with him, and you can just go with him now." So I very meekly did not write my note. But when Sunday afternoon came, a nice horse with a pretty little top buggy stopped out in front of Miss Cruz's house. And here Mr. Cannon got out of the buggy and came into the house with a box of candy and asked me to go for a drive. After that, I would have gone any place with him. Because in those days, to get a horse from the livery stable and to go take a young lady for a drive was just about the finest thing that could happen to you. And to bring a box of candy, too, that was just too much. I went to the dance with him the next week and missed no more dances thereafter.
How very nice. How soon after you met Mr. Cannon were you married?
Oh, I taught another year, and then I went to Washington to school a year before we were married.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was told that you had a very exciting wedding. Could you tell us something about that?
I was married in my home in Gainesville. It was an evening wedding. And it was a very nice wedding for those days. The house was pretty, and my good friends were there. We were married by a Presbyterian minister in Gainesville. And we left to come to Ardmore about 10:30, but the train was late on account of the cold. It was due in Ardmore at 12:30, but we didn't get here until about 2 o'clock because of the ice and snow. Mr. Cannon had engaged a carriage to meet us at the station, and Miss Cruz who I might say had been responsible for my coming to Ardmore, had come down to the wedding. So, of course, we had to take her home. We had quite a hectic drive as we went over those frozen roads. But I've lived happily ever after.
I see. Mrs. Cannon, did you have a hope chest prepared before you were married?
Oh, yes, indeed. And I had enjoyed very much hem stitching and putting all of the hems into dozens of napkins. I monogrammed all my towels and sheets and pillowcases, napkins and tablecloths. I had made all of my underwear, and many of those things had lace flounces on them. My wedding coat, my wedding petticoat particularly, had a lot of work on it because it was long and had a flounce made of lace insertion with insets of cambric. There were 112 pieces, triangular shape cambric, which had been rolled and whipped and set together with this lace insertion, and that formed the flounce on the paper.
Well, Mrs. Cannon, I'd like to thank you very much for your time spent in making this recording for the University of Oklahoma. This interview has been made by Peggy Smithwick, senior in Ardmore High School. The date, February 9, 1956.